February topics have been rather dry and lacking in fun materials to make a video with, and most of the hooplas I'd rather talk on stream than on video. So instead of talking about whatever things that people get outraged at, let me talk about a film that I really love, and a film that I want every single one of you to watch. And no, it's not Perfect Blue, or at least for this video, but you should see Perfect Blue if you haven't already. Instead, it's an anime film about the most typical anime topic, which is high school anime romance. It's a film with a genre so typical for anime as the burning hot sun for every summer day in a tropical island. And yet, despite having a common everyday topic with little to no fantastical elements onto it, it's still an anime that manages to tug my heartstrings and brought me into tears without the needs of putting the characters in a great peril. It's also the only film I can think of that actually brought me into tears of joy rather than tears of sadness. And that film, ladies and gentlemen, is Anthem of the Heart. I did not expect Anthem of the Heart to be an absolute masterpiece when I saw it for the first time. I chose to see it because the creators of Anthem of the Heart was releasing a new anime film to the theaters called Her Blue Sky, which was unfortunately not as good. The creators also made Anohana, an anime that I haven't seen but I've heard mixed receptions too. Some say it's good, others say it's meh. I can tell you for sure that Anthem of the Heart is one of the few films that I've seen in my entire life, besides Kurosawa's Seven Samurai and Schindler's List, that has entered my all-time classic immediately after I saw the film. And after more rewatches of the film, I still consider it an all-time classic. Why? Because everything about this film is perfect. The story is perfect, the character development is perfect, the emotional impact is perfect. All of this is done while presenting a fairly simple and basic story that can happen to quite a lot of us in real life. A story dealing with social anxiety, friendship, self-expression, and the inability of doing so due to the mounting mental pressures. It's an amazing coming-of-age drama that brought me into tears of joy. So if you haven't seen this anime yet, please do yourselves a favor and see it, because this video is just gonna be me going through every plot point of the anime and gushing about why it's so perfect. There will be spoilers, so come back here once you watched it, or if you just want to listen to me gush over this anime anyway, then stick around. The movie begins in a typical modern setting. It's springtime and there's a little girl running around in a small town of some sort. Our main character is Jun Naruse, a little girl who is cheerful and happy and all of that stuff. Typical little girl protagonist, or at least at first. She tends to open her mouth a lot and talk out the things that are in her mind, which unfortunately is going to hurt her for a long time as the film goes forward. Anyway, the film establishes that there's one place that she really wants to go to, and that place is far beyond in the mountain. It was a big castle full of colors and wonders. She runs into the castle and it's revealed that the castle is actually not a castle. The castle is a hotel, a love hotel that is, which is quite common in Japan, just look a lot less like a castle and more like your typical suburban apartment, or at least the cheapest ones. Considering the castle design of this love hotel, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a Disney-themed love hotel. Gather around and screw all the sexy princesses. Warning, some of them are under 18. Anyway, our protagonist Jun initially thought of this place as an incredibly magical place full of wonders and excitement, which is true, but not in a way that she thinks. Someday, I too will head to the ball at the castle with a charming prince, she thought. Well, you can't get into the place very early on, especially if you signed a contract with that very nice man in the free candy van, except the ball that you're heading to will be his, and he won't be as charming. But then, as she wanders in front of the hotel, she notices a familiar presence. Who is this? Well, it turns out that this person is her dad. He's riding a car out of the hotel with an unknown woman, and being the innocent kid that she is, she imagines this scenario with her dad riding on a car like a prince riding with a princess on a horse. Jun is a bit weird like that, but give her some slack, she's a kid, one that has mental issues at the top of neglectful parents. Basically what happens to a lot of autistic kids these days, unfortunately. Oh, by the way, this film is one of those semi-fantastical films, one that has fantasy elements, but all of it is established to happen in the characters' head. good, and it's all done very well, especially within the context that June is a kid, and therefore full of energy and imagination, something that we can relate to. The juxtaposition between her viewpoint and reality is done in a way that is convincing enough for us to believe, and grounded enough for us to be able to see something like this happening in real life, in the heads of actual kids in real life. After she saw all of that, she decided to tell her mother about the big secret. What's the big secret, you might ask? The mother did stall her for a bit by giving her some fried eggs, but after that, her mother tells her that she's quite a chatterbox. She decided to tell the mother the big secret, which is that daddy just came out of the castle. Since the mother knew what kind of castle that was, the mother took it very well, especially the part where June said that the princess is not her. In fact, she even innocently calls her own mother a witch. A good witch, yes, but her mom proceeds to shut her mouth after that. I mean, Christ almighty, June, your mother's hearts can only be broken as much. The mother eventually tells her that she should not talk about it and never talk about it again. The screen cuts to black and then it cuts to her father moving out, revealing that they pretty much have divorced at that point. The narration still reveals that June is still looking at the world through that fairy tale perspective, with all of the childhood innocence that is contained within. Unfortunately, her parents don't see it that way, especially her lying, cheating dad, who decides to become a massive goddamn prick and says that all of this was thanks to her being a chatterbox, and how all of this is her fault, causing her to burst into tears. You egotistical, disloyal, unfaithful douchebag. 5 minutes into this film and I'm already more emotionally invested than your average live-action Disney film. This entire prologue is amazing. I love that everything is taking place on June's perspective, but at the same time shows the reality of the situation so that we as adults can understand. June, unfortunately, is still a kid and therefore still doesn't understand the complexities of marriage, something that her parents did not explain to her. Her mother didn't explain to her because she's still under emotional torment from her lying, cheating ex, and her father didn't because he's just a massive prick. It's a terrible situation all around and a heartbreakingly effective way to accentuate the point how your innocent childhood fantasies can seriously hurt your perception of reality, especially the way June loves to be a chatterbox and talk out everything that she thinks right now, which eventually becomes the catalyst of her parents' separation. All of this is some genuinely traumatic stuff, which causes her to get so mentally damaged she ends up talking to an imaginary egg, who also calls her a chatterbox. I absolutely love what they did with the egg, or at least the egg in this particular scenario. It's a visual representation of the inner voices inside her head, a voice that tries so hard to rationalize and make sense of the situation, but spins them in the most mentally destructive way imaginable. It's the kind of inner voices that even a lot of adults suffer through, and even they couldn't handle it, let alone a kid. And again, all of this is so grounded in reality. It all happens in her head, and I assume a lot of people's head when they suffer through such a traumatic event, trying to rationalize and justify the situation in the best way that they possibly could, even while having so little information and so little time to process. June doesn't understand and why her parents would split that way. All she can do is to rationalize everything that happens in a way that a kid would, or a Disney fan kid would, which is through the lens of a fairy tale where life is all simple and people can live happily ever after. Unfortunately, none of her parents would explain everything to her because 1, they're still emotionally tormented thanks to the divorce, and 2, because both of them are neglectful, irresponsible, and have about as much understanding to their own child as the corporation's understanding of their customers' economic crisis in current year. The egg prince, or the voices in her head, then convinced her that it's because her being a chatterbox that ruins her parents' relationship, and thus convinces her to never ever speak again. A silent voice, if you will. Except a silent voice has Shoko with a physical disability. She's deaf. The voices that she's hearing are silent. June, on the other hand, has a mental disability that was caused by her childhood trauma. It's not that she's hearing silent voices, it's that she mentally pressures herself to keep her voice silent due to her trauma, which I argue is a lot more heartbreaking. And her repressed mental trauma continues all all the way to high school. That's right, she keeps on being silent all the way to high school, which is in contrast to Shoko, where she's actually perfectly fine all the way to high school, or at least until Shoya and the gang shows up again. The mental trauma is so strong, June becomes a social outcast, notorious for being silent and not speaking her words out at school. This is how you do it. This is how you make me feel an emotional connection with the character. This is how you can truly justify her antisocial tendencies, show that the character went through a believable trauma that makes her to be that way. Anyways, the film moves on to another protagonist of the story, which is Takumi Sakagami. Takumi is just your normal average high school student who is so generic he looks like a ripoff of either Oreki from Hyoka or Shiki from Tsukihime. But he is gonna be one of the catalysts for the story to come. On the way to school, he picks up a bunch of colorful eggs being quite the motive for this entire film. These eggs act like some sort of offering where you say the words that you want, contain it inside, and then hang it. The story moves on to show your typical everyday high school life. It was all normal at first, until suddenly, the music teacher Shimacho decides to announce the committee members of the community outreach program. The members are as follows: Takumi, which surprised him, Daiki Tasaki, which is the resident jock, Natsuki Nito, which is Takumi's sort of ex-girlfriend, and finally June, which surprised everyone in the class. June, being the girl notorious for never speaking at all, stood up to protest, but she couldn't even muster the courage to speak and has to go into the bathroom as expected. What I didn't expect is the other high schoolers chastising the teacher for choosing her in the first place. No, really, the people in the class actually feel sorry for her and genuinely want her to feel better despite the fact that she never spoke to them at all. But still, this is a very difficult situation for them. These 4 individuals eventually have to come up with something for the community outreach program. So what are they going to create? Well, first off, they need to be able to communicate, and Daiki immediately took the first step in telling Takumi that he leaves everything to him. Well, that was very helpful, although I can't exactly blame him for this. If I got assigned to a job as mundane as this, I too would sit at the corner doing nothing. Actually, Daiki himself is dealing with a subplot of the film. Thanks to his injury, he is unable to contribute for his baseball team, which causes a rift between him and the team as a whole. This is among one of the many subplots that we're going to discuss in the film. These subplots are essential to the film in order to establish the underlying message. Daiki is the resident school jock. He's the ace of the entire baseball team and has brought them and the school into many victories, but that doesn't mean that he is able to express himself that well. He too feels some level of frustration of the team, especially thanks to his injuries. His frustration lies on how the team is managed and he is unable to put them into words. Both Takumi and Natsuki don't really have any issues befriending with others and communicating with other people. They're very friendly and have social circles of their own, even if it's not much, but them being sort of exes means that they too have difficulty in expressing themselves, specifically their feelings to each other, and the vagueness of the status of their relationship. These subplots contribute very well to the underlying main plot of June's struggle in overcoming her mental state of being unable to speak her words very well. At the end of the day, we as everyday people suffer what June suffered as well, to a lesser extent. We can be the most charismatic and talkative individual on the planet Earth, but there are definitely many things in the world that we are unable to share, one that might hurt other people's feelings, one that might show who we really are as a person, one that are too embarrassing to talk about. June represents that side of us that we all have, except it's multiplied into infinity. It's exaggerated to the point where she is unable to communicate her words at all, but it's not so exaggerated to the point where it's implausible. I do believe that a kid can get through all of that trauma and suffer through that amount of mental damage that she is unable to speak or communicate at all. It is something that can totally happen to people in real life. Japanese media have dealt with social anxieties before. Some dealt it with such level of quirkiness that it's impossible to dislike, but social anxiety is a genuine problem that can cost a lot of people's lives. This film dealt with it in a shockingly realistic manner, one that shows how deep down we all suffer from it. We too suffer from a certain level of social anxiety. It's not a problem of some socially repressed individuals, it's a problem that we all suffer from. Moving on with the story, Jun notices that Takumi plays the accordion really well, which is believable because he's a piano player, and a really good one at that. Represent. Also, that gamelan in the background. Represent. Anyways, Jun listens to Takumi playing through it, singing about eggs, specifically the eggs that he helped carry with. She got really amazed and entranced by it. For a while. That is, until the music teacher Shimacho storms into the place and causing her to fluster. Without too much argument, Jun shoves her appeal to not be a member of the committee and left the building. Well, that was very fast, but at least we finally see her communicate. It's a piece of paper, but it's something. Takumi and the teacher eventually chat with each other. The teacher reveals that he too really likes what Takumi is playing, though Takumi says that it was just something random. Takumi reveals that his ability to play music is thanks to him knowing someone who plays a lot of musical, which is an important plot point that we'll get to in a bit. The teacher realizes that a musical is the absolute best show for the community outreach event. And here's another thing that I love about this anime. I don't like musical at all. I'm not that much of a fan of it, and yet for some reason I really love this one. That's right, this anime technically counts as a musical, and I think I know why I like this one a lot more than other musicals. It's because the musical is perfectly justified. The characters don't just sing random songs out of nowhere like they're in a freaking Disney cartoon. The characters sing because they want to express their emotions, which is also what happened in Disney cartoons, but at least the scenarios aren't as contrived. Funnily enough, the characters on this anime even make fun of other musicals. The scenarios in the anime are scenarios that would happen in real life. As someone who plays music, I too would hop into some random instrument and play it and sing along to a song that I really like. But it's not just that part that makes me like the musical in this one a lot more. It's also the fact that the musical is quite central to the characters' development. It's the fact that the characters are pouring their heart and soul into the music. All of that will come together in a really satisfying climax. But we'll get to that in a bit. Jun hides herself on the school's rooftop and reveals that she feels like Takumi has seen into her heart and see what she has seen. It would have been much better if you talk it out with people, Jun, but hey, we all know how you do it words, or more specifically, not do it words. Takumi, on the other hand, is just chilling. You might notice that Takumi is living with his grandparents. Well, there's a reason for that. It's a very important subplot actually, one that totally reinforces the relationship between the two of our protagonists, but we'll get to that in a bit. Takumi went back to his home to notice that Jun's mother is actually at home. She's doing her best in being a saleswoman, but she's way too embarrassed in admitting about her daughter being there. Jun's mother struggles so much at work, she's practically clueless in what her daughter thinks, or how her daughter works in general, which unfortunately results in her lashing out at her for things that Jun has no control over and isn't responsible to. She even feels ashamed of acknowledging her own daughter and had to make up lies about her being a chatterbox to everyone just to hide her embarrassment. This is actually a very real issue, especially for people with mental disabilities. Some of them fortunately have good parents, but some of them are just not good parents. It can be because they're abusive and just neglectful to their children in general, or it can be because they're just exhausted and clueless. In Jun's case, it's because she's traumatized, exhausted, and all of that leads into her being clueless and neglectful about her child. She's already mentally tormented by the fact that her husband cheated on her, and she has to deal with the responsibility of taking care of her own child, one that also suffers from her own trauma. One really depressing thing about her is that she doesn't see her child as her child. She doesn't see her as a last glimmer of hope that she has for her life. She sees her as another sign of her failure in life. The fact that she's too embarrassed to acknowledge her and even make up lies about her is a sign that she has pretty much given up on her, in the same way that a lot of parents have given up on their children, because she sees her failure in her. She sees her as the big red mark of life that says F all over it, a sign that she has failed as a parent to really raise her child, something that she doesn't want to confront and is too afraid to confront. A more poignant question to be had is Is it really her fault? It's an unfortunate situation all around, and she too subsequently becomes a victim of the underlying social anxiety message of the film. She's so mentally damaged that she can't stay level-headed for her child, or even pretend to be level-headed. Takumi's grandma brought the point that she is a single mother struggling to raise a child of her own, which is indeed very amazing. I initially disliked the mother for not being a good parent to June, and look at her as another big red mark for her, but now that I wrote this entire thing, I ended up appreciating her character a lot more, and seeing the struggle that she went through, and how she can even get up to this point. She doesn't have a lot of screen time, but the moment that she does, you can genuinely feel her being a walking corpse. So after briefly meeting June's mother, we get into the next section of the film. Look at those angklungs, man, represent! This is the point where the film tells the audiences, hey, in musicals, you convey your emotions through songs. Okay, film, we get it. Though funnily enough, June took this message to heart, and we'll get to that in a bit. The first community outreach community meeting has started, with all the members present except Daiki because, as we established earlier, he left it all to Takumi and the rest of the team to an extent. They talk about how this event is really not that important anyway, because only old people come in, so they can just do it with the usual stuff like the choirs. Simacho, however, disagrees and wants them to break the status quo in this process. I love how this film emphasizes that this event is something that they can just half-ass with, and how insignificant it is to the character's life. At the end of the day, it's really not that much of an important event for the characters, or at least on paper. They're there because they're obligated to be there, so they don't really have to put their heart and soul into it. So it makes it more satisfying when they do actually put their heart and soul into it, and actually having some character development as they do it. They totally disagreed about the idea of the outreach being a musical, so they conclude the meeting to think about it. But then as they went out, they see the baseball team complaining about the jock Daiki because he is pissed at how the team is going, and he ends up micromanaging every aspect of the team to the point of their annoyance. And this is where Natsuki said the armor-piercing sentence: if they have something to say, they should just speak it up. Ironic that she said that, considering how even she has trouble saying her feelings to Takumi. June ends up following Takumi because he's the only person who truly understands her somewhat. As we establish, he sees her through her heart, and because of that, she tries to find some form of understanding on the issues that she is suffering right now. And this is where the relationship between Takumi and June are established, and how June slowly begins to form feelings to him. A feeling that is unfortunately unrequited. Takumi tries to go back home, but June follows him. Takumi asks if June likes the musical idea, and June proceeds to do the Komi-san thing of using text to communicate. But what she said to him was rather weird. She said, "Are you peeking into my heart?" which confuses Takumi for a bit, but June tries to overcome her nervousness and just straight up pulls Takumi into some random place. This is where June tells her backstory to Takumi through the medium of text. I like how June has matured enough to recognize that what her father did was adultery. After June tells her backstory to Takumi, including the fact that she's talking to an imaginary egg, Takumi comments at how mind-blowing everything is, and he meant it in an incredibly messed up way. Glad you clarified that, Takumi, because otherwise you're a little bit messed up in the head. Takumi clarifies to June that she misunderstood things. He doesn't really peek into her heart. The egg song on the other day was sung from a random story that he heard from the old guy last time. June explains the situation by trying to say that she has a stomachache, but she can't say it and put it into words instead. So she texts it to him and say that every time she speaks, she got a stomachache, which she thinks is a curse to her. June then asks if Takumi really believes that people can convey their feelings better through songs. Takumi answers yes, rather bluntly, and even says that maybe singing doesn't count for the curse that causes her stomachache, which causes June to go back home immediately because she too has stomachache, which I assume is more on the butterflies variety. June then eventually tries to sing her words out. It turns out that she can actually sing without hurting her stomach, which is nice. Now let's get back to Daiki's subplot. Daiki is not a fan of his team's turnout and has to grudgingly admit that his friend is a good captain, something that he is too insecure to say. The committee announces to the class on what they're going to do for the program, and the class is visibly disappointed with the options, one of which is Daiki, who after he got frustrated by his team, has to vent his frustration to the entire class as well. Out of nowhere, Daiki decides to just shift his entire frustration towards June of all people, people simply because she can't speak. This is one of Daiki's breaking points in that his frustration got so bad, he decides to speak up his mind and straight up call June useless. Takumi decides to defend her. Remember that part where Takumi eavesdrops on his team, calling him useless because he manages them too much? Well, Takumi decides to bring that up again and talk about how he shouldn't judge people for being useless while he himself is, or at least according to the team. But one of the team members decide to confront Takumi for saying such lies, even though it's true. And the class eventually gets so messy and they're eventually going to fight. That is until... Yep, that just happened. Completely out of the blue, June decides to sing. Her singing is so powerful that the entire class stops arguing and fighting. And of course, June cannot proceed any further and just quits into the bathroom. She then tells Takumi that when she sings, it actually doesn't hurt, which means that it works, right? She can just convey her feelings, but only through a musical, right? Well, it's not that simple. Daiki for once chose not to oversee the practice because he has errands. It was a lie, he doesn't have errands, he just doesn't want to bother the team that much. Daiki then learns from his friend that Natsuki has a little bit of a past. Natsuki tries to go back home and Daiki is on the same train station. Out of nowhere, Daiki asks Natsuki out for a date, but Natsuki reveals that she's looking out for someone else, and thus confirming the past that his friend talked about. Daiki then asks how long has Natsuki been with Takumi, which is her ex-boyfriend back in junior high, to which Natsuki reveals that they haven't even held hands together or know each other's email address. I love how they use going into the castle as a euphemism. At night, some women knock on the door at June's house, and June answered it this time, which is unlike any other time where she just left her mother to do it for obvious reasons. Her mother was way too late in her work and is actually rather pissed that June answered the door. As I said, her mother sees June as another mark of failure in her life, and thus putting her in a difficult position of being proud of acknowledging that that's her daughter. June gets into the night and decides to write one heck of a text box towards Takumi, then trying her hardest to tell him verbally that he should turn her words into a song. Characters actually doing their hardest to overcome their obstacles to become better people in life? Jesus Christ, film, stop making me love you even more. What June actually wrote in that big freaking text wall is actually a really dark fairy tale, one that someone represents her story and the kind of torment that she gets through. She expresses this through the text and wants Takumi and the rest of the team to turn it into the musical, thus pretty much making her the brainchild of this entire operation and the important cogwheel that turns all the mechanisms of the story into play. I love this movie, I love this movie, I love this movie. Takumi describes how disturbing the entire thing is, especially in how everything was based on her experience, but funnily enough, June doesn't really know how it ends, which is in parallel to how she doesn't really know how this would end up. And this is where Takumi asks if they can use the room upstairs. For what, you might ask? Well, it's not for anything dirty, it's just a music room actually, which was owned by Takumi's dad. Takumi says that their musical strategy is just to stick up new lyrics to already existing melodies, which explains why the songs in here are actually not new songs, but rather the same melodies of the song's music with the lyrics change. This is where Takumi decides to flex his music. That's one of the very rare times in which June has a genuine smile, so cherish that as much as you can. Takumi also made quite the witty remark, saying that while June doesn't speak out what she says, she still displays what she's thinking. She denies it, and Takumi proceeds to laugh, as I did as well, because it's a nice little bit of comedy through this rather depressing display of social anxiety. After a couple of funny kerfuffles later, the committee meet up together in a cafe of some sort. This time, however, Daiki decides to join. Actually, while they were talking about the upcoming musical play, Daiki was about to apologize to June, but then a group of Daiki's baseball teammates are actually visiting the same restaurant. They're not only slacking off from their practice, but also bad-mouthing him. Let's just say that they are electrified of his appearance. The group eventually apologized to him in succession, except for one person who decides to continue bad-mouthing him in front of his face and saying that he wants him to just disappear already, which really pissed off June of all people. She proceeds to tell them verbally that they should be careful of their words because they cannot take those words back. And seeing her say all of that genuinely surprised me because I've been with her about like 52 minutes and most of them she spent not talking. Juxtaposition, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, June was exhausted with saying all of that to the point where she had to be brought to a hospital. June's mother got really worried and visited her in there. Deep down, despite her embarrassment towards her, she still does care for her. And this leads into a rather emotional moment between June and her mother. What really surprised me is that her mother actually knew about the curse and the stomachache. It's just that she chose not to believe it. What she believes instead is June choosing not to speak because she hates her? I'm sorry, what? Then she talks about how the neighbors always gossip about June, how she has no idea what June is trying to do, asking if she's doing it just to spite her. I mean, damn, she's so clueless about what happens to her daughter, she's actually assuming malicious intent out of the poor girl. Takumi then has to step forward and defend June and say that June is a good kid. She is. Anyway, Natsuki then praises Takumi for what he did in the hospital, saying that she was surprised, although she backtracks and saying that she was surprised at all kinds of things. Takumi expresses that he's a boring guy, but Natsuki rebuffs that instantly by saying that he's not. He's always considerate and always look out for people if they're in trouble. Natsuki just realized that she's just fangirling over Takumi and immediately stops before embarrassing herself even further, with Takumi simply answering thanks. I have a feeling that their old romance is going to continue blossoming again. And all of that thanks to a girl who barely talks. The next day, Daiki decides to go into his former teammates and apologize to them for his bossy behaviors, promising to join them when he's fully healed, promising to deal with his problems one by one. He then proceeds to actually apologize to June, and that made June so happy and him blushing like crazy. I mean, good God, film, you don't have to give character development to the jock at the school, but hey, one subplot resolved, and it's all thanks to a girl who barely talks, with a smile as bright as the freaking sunrise. It's amazing how she manages to change the people around her without her really doing much. I freaking love this film. And speaking of June changing everyone, the committee decides to commit to the musical idea. And all of that was said by none other than Daiki himself, which surprises everyone because he was really against the idea at first, and also pisses off everyone at the same time because of how tiring and taxing it is for them. But eventually, after a little bit of convincing from the committee members, they ended up doing it anyway and putting their passion into it, almost as if this musical play is their brainchild of absolute creativity. Cue montage of them preparing for all that stuff. Anyways, June and Natsuki are walking together to Takumi's house. Natsuki seems rather disappointed to hear that June knew where Takumi's house is. I mean, obviously, crush is just one of those things that you can't express very well. June says that it's rather weird for her to be walking with friends and gathering up with friends, something that she once thought impossible, implying that Natsuki is her friend. She then backtracks her statement about Natsuki being her friend because she's afraid of her being mad about it, but Natsuki says she doesn't mind being her friend at all. Aww. The group then proceeds to discuss about the play, the musical, and all of that, with Takumi playing the music through the piano. Specifically, he's playing Beethoven Sonata's second movement, Pathetique. This is where we get to a genuinely touching character development between June and Takumi. So if you can't tell already from the way Takumi lives with his grandparents, Takumi's parents are actually divorced. His mother left him and his father gives him to his own parents because he has loads and loads of work. There's one thing that really surprised me thanks thanks to this knowledge that Jun gained, but we'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, Jun ends up walking together with Daiki. There's a very wholesome interaction between the two. Daiki realizes that the people that they're working with for the play are talented people and how cool the people that he's working with. Jun praises Daiki for realizing all of that himself. Daiki blushes on that statement. Oh, and in case you couldn't tell, he actually has a crush on Jun. No, really, he does. Jun then decides to change the ending to a more happier one as opposed to the original bleak one, which is in parallel towards how she feels towards the group as a whole. While changing the ending, Takumi decides to remix Pathetique with playing it at the same time with Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz. Takumi reminisces about his dad and how his parents were already fighting before junior high. Turns out he blames himself for his parents' divorce as they were fighting about where he wants to go to school. Thanks to their divorce, he becomes afraid of touching the piano for years, and all of that changed thanks to this girl who can barely speak. And here's a moment that genuinely surprises me. Jun tells Takumi that there is no way that what happened is his fault. That's right, Jun of all people tells Takumi that it's not his fault that his parents got divorced. The entire point of Jun's backstory is that she blames herself for her parents splitting up. But the thing is, she never really seen anyone else suffer from the same fate, or in fact, anyone else in general. Now that she knew how Takumi suffered from the same fate, she got the chance to take the outsider's perspective, and she too realizes that none of it was Takumi's fault. Takumi then plays the reverse Suno card and says, "Same goes to you. It's not your fault that your parents split up," which was a statement so poignant, Jun text walls Takumi about how much of an amazing guy he is. Man, I swear the character development of this movie is so good. Unfortunately, this is where things get really messed up. This is where love begins to cloud all judgment. The class is pretty much done for their rehearsal and everything seems to be going well for the entire team. Takumi and Natsuki are told to gather things up together. Cue awkward romance. No, really, awkward romance. They walk around the school complex and notice two characters making out. Awkward. Takumi asks Natsuki about dating and asks if Natsuki is looking for someone. Natsuki, however, bursts into tears and accuses Takumi of being in love with Jun. Unfortunately, Takumi explicitly says that he is not interested in Jun. And guess who overhears all of that? That's right, Jun overhears the entire thing. This anime was going so well, it decides to pull off the oldest freaking cliche in the book. To be fair to the anime, it's not really a misunderstanding. Takumi actually meant what he said when he said he didn't like Jun that way. It's just that Jun has practically zero experience in dealing with love, and she lives in such a fairy tale world of her own that she thinks that the men who are being kind to her is her prince and her love interest. This is unfortunately a common assumption that a lot of either socially inexperienced or really depressed people suffer from, and that they assume act of kindnesses are signs of a more serious affection, when in reality, it's just basic human decency. So even if I thought this moment is a cliche, it's still a genuinely heartbreaking look towards Jun's mind. It's to the point where the egg comes back to haunt her again. The negative emotions and minds inside her head continue to torment her, ridiculing her, and blaming her for the things that just happened. All of it came back at the same time, assaulting her with her senses. The day for the play has finally come. Everyone is ready to commit to their acts. Unfortunately, Jun is not in the stage for reasons that we've already talked about before. After a heated exchange with the group, the committee member convinces them to please give Jun a slight bit of chance and have Takumi to go look for her. They all agreed. Takumi finds Jun on the castle, crying in despair and realizing that the prince that she looks out for will never ever come. Takumi allows Jun to just barrage him with endless amounts of insults and bad words and begging her to do so. Damn, Takumi, you don't have to express your verbal abuse fetish that much. But for real though, Takumi expresses that he feels gratitude of how Jun has totally changed him and make him to be a more positive person. He expresses that it was all thanks to her that he is able to realize his real self. Jun proceeds to say likewise and then tries to confess to him, but Takumi rejects it. with June saying that she already knew that that's his answer. That's another thing that I like about this anime. This anime is dealing with rejection, but the characters accept that rejection instead of moping around and trying their hardest not to move on from them. It also somewhat subverts my expectations on her ending up with Takumi at the end, but it's done in a way that is actually believable, one that doesn't make me hate all the characters involved. The play has been going on for a while. June's mother is there to see her, but she was utterly disappointed that she wasn't there, to the point where she almost left. If it weren't for Takumi's grandparents stopping her, she wouldn't have been there at all. Way to be the MVP, grandparents. June finally arrives near the very end of the play, fittingly in a very climactic and perfect timing for her to arrive. This moment over here burst me into joyful tears every single time I saw it. It's absolutely freaking phenomenal, and I'm telling you, you cannot feel the impact if you just watch this video. You have to see the film and get absorbed by its characters to really feel the gut punch of this segment, to see all the silent June Naruse singing her lungs out and expressing her genuine emotions alongside her friends is the most perfect way to end this film. And it feels so surreal in how fairy tale-esque this film ends up being, despite taking place in a more realistic world that we live in every day. And speaking of fairy tale, everyone gets a rather happy ending, but it's actually more implied than explicitly told. Remember when I say that Daiki has a crush on June? Here he is, expressing that he's going to confess to her. When Daiki says that, Takumi says that he too wants to confess to Natsuki, but Natsuki tells him that he should just confess in a more appropriate time. The film ends with Daiki confessing to June, and June puts on her really shocked face. I mean, good Lord Almighty, this video is already pretty long, but that's because I gush in on almost every single thing that I love about this movie. The plot points, the character interactions, the development, how the story is really grounded in reality, how the musical components end up being the most utterly satisfying part of the entire film, despite me not liking musical at all. If you have not seen this film, please do yourselves a favor and go see this film. It's one of my favorite anime films. It's one of my favorite films in general. It's one that I will incessantly recommend to everyone, especially those who are hungry for some romance anime, and one that deals with the topic of social anxiety in a starkly realistic manner that everyone can relate to. It's so realistic that they actually have a live-action adaptation, which I haven't seen, but at least this is an anime that fits for a live-action adaptation than, say, Attack on Titan. What I can tell you is that the anime is perfect. It's beautiful, and I don't mind seeing it over and over and over again.